Well, good morning, everyone. Again, for those of you who came in, happy Mother's Day. I'm gonna jump right in today, just for the sake of time. The time seems to go so quickly. Um, so, for those of you who are here for the first time, and I don't remember how many of you were here. It looks like a lot. I see a lot of familiar faces, but we are doing a series here, 4-week series on Christian nationalism. And in last week's opening week of the series, we defined some of our terms. These terms can kind of get very complicated because they are terms that often have definitions that sort of bleed into one another. So we defined what it meant to be, what I was defining, or my working definition of Christian nationalism. Uh, I also talked about the idea of civil religion, and what the distinctions were between Christian nationalism and civil religion. Civil religion, I should say, being very much a way in which America sort of understood their sense of patriotism, and often fusing Enlightenment ideas about liberty and freedom with sort of vague and general references to God, nothing too specific, nothing too Christian, right? But certainly Judeo Christian ideas of like in God we trust, or, those kinds of things. Christian nationalism, a relatively new term, as I pointed out last week, is really something that um, has taken on a life of its own in the last decade or so, but especially within the last 5 years. And it is the idea that America was founded as a distinctly Christian nation, and that nation then must be reclaimed, renewed, restored. And it usually is associated with a particular kind of definition of Christianity, namely a kind of conservative, theologically conservative, evangelical Christianity. So again, I'm not going to go over that again. I said to Debbie, some of you may have heard me say this earlier, who were on the call. I'm happy to share some of these, or share all of these slides with you, so you can dig into that. And just one other point I want to make about last week, and I brought this up last week, but I think it's worth mentioning one more time. There's also, for Christians, there's also kind of another community, right? The church. And oftentimes we can confuse biblical Christianity with both civil religion and Christian nationalism, right? The teachings of Christianity are global. They apply to all people, regardless of nation. So I think it's important to remember that the church at some time is going to offer some type of a critique to both civil religion and Christian nationalism, right? So again, definitions and nuance here, I think, is important. But today, as promised, I want to talk about the Bible, and particularly the Bible in the American founding. But we'll try to make some contemporary connections to this as well, as some of you can see the next slide that's coming. So what I want to do today is what is the what did the founding fathers, who, the men who kind of created this country, what did they think about the Bible? What was their views on the Bible? Um, did they use the Bible at all in their defense of American liberty against the British, for example, during the American Revolution? Did they use the Bible in the shaping of some of our founding documents, or for rationale behind the American Revolution? And again, we'll spill over into next week with this too, when we talk about Christianity. And again, we'll get back into the Bible a little bit. And the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth. But today, I just want to kind of introduce you to the role that the Bible played in the American founding, and how the founders and ministers of the era, mostly patriotic, but not necessarily, as we'll see, ministers used the Bible during this period. And I think there's a lot of similarities I recently started a new online platform, I guess you could call it, online magazine. Some of you are familiar with my blog. I moved my blog over to a new space called Current, where you can find at currentpub.com. And we run a feature piece by other authors every day, and then I blog on the right side of the page. But this week, I wrote one of the feature pieces on this very subject. And one of the ways that I led that piece was by talking about some recent comments by former Vice President Mike Pence. So here we have this slide. Mike Pence gave a speech in at the Republican National Convention. Remember, it was all social distance and online virtual convention, but he did give a sort of face-to-face speech at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And I was really, really struck, as someone who studied the use of the Bible at the time of the American founding. I was really, really struck by the way in which there's so much continuity between the way the founders used the Bible. They were politicians too, and the way in which Mike Pence uses the Bible. And we don't have to just pick on Mike Pence, but he's the most recent example of, but the way Mike Pence used the Bible at Fort McHenry, is I pointed out in this article, is as old as the Republic. The Bible has been used to advance political purposes, or by politicians, for a long, long time. But just let's look at these references here. These are all from the same speech. So one of Mike Pence's favorite verses that he likes to use is 2 Chronicles 7:14. And some of you who follow this closely may have noticed that Mike Pence gave a National Prayer Day speech the other day, on Thursday, I think it was, with National Day of Prayer, in which he quoted this passage again. But what you see on the screen right now are actually the way, I should have done a comparison here, but these are actually the way that Mike Pence quotes these verses. They are with the exception of Second Corinthians, that should be Second Corinthians 3:17. But let me just read them to you. So 2 Chronicles 7:14. This will sound familiar to some of you, but maybe the Pence version might be something that's new. So here's Pence at that speech at Fort McHenry. If his people are called by his name, who are called by his name, will humble themselves and pray, he'll do like he's always done through the long and storied history of this land. You'll hear from heaven. He'll heal this land, this one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, as some of you are aware, that is not what exactly word for word what 2 Chronicles 7:14 says. But notice what Pence did to the text. He added in the long and storied history of this land. In context, he had just been talking about the history of the country and the founding fathers and so forth. And then, of course, he fuses 2 Chronicles 7:14 with the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Or at least the pre-19 or the post-1950s version of the Pledge of Allegiance, which includes one nation under God. The phrase "one nation under God" was inserted into the the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s. So it's a very creative kind of use of scripture there, fusing American nationalism with the Bible. Now, he did get 2 Corinthians 3:17 correct, right? Now, the Spirit of the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, or there is liberty. But again, if you thought about this in the context that Mike Pence uses it here, he is clearly speaking here. Again, we don't have to go back and look at the speech. You can find it easily on YouTube. He's talking here less about kind of liberty and freedom in Christ, or freedom from sin, or freedom from the wiles of the devil or something like that. I mean, he's using this in the context of political freedom, American freedom, liberty. And one of the things I pointed out in that article this week was he had also been talking in this context about the coronavirus, and talking about speaking to an audience that largely believed that they have freedom to go maskless or not to social distance, and those kinds of things. So I thought this was an interesting use of 2 Corinthians 3:17. But probably the most glaring example of this fusion of political and nationalism with the Bible came when Pence quoted Hebrews chapter 12. Now, again, you need to remember in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 12 comes after Hebrews 11, which is the great chapter of the Hall of Fame, so to speak, of faith, the great heroes of the faith, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, so on down the line, David. And then chapter 12 begins, right? Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, right? So here's Pence, right? Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. So far, so good. That's exactly what Hebrews 12, 1 says. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So let's run the race marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus. No, let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on this land of heroes, right? And again, these are not heroes, Abraham and David and so forth. He's referring to, all the heroic people who lived in American history. And let their courage inspire us. And let's fix our eyes on the author of our and perfecter of our faith and our freedom, and never forget where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So again, he goes back here to 2 Corinthians 3:17. So he fuses a kind of nationalist message. 2 Corinthians 3:17 gets thrown in, and in this mash, and of course Hebrews 12. So I do this because I want to show you now, as we go back into the 18th century here, that what you see in the 18th century, what I'm going to show you, is not necessarily new and has been continuing to go on since the beginning of the Republic. So let's talk a little bit here about the Bible and the founding fathers. I was trying all morning to try to get this to get these parallel designs here, but I couldn't get the right side with the blue, to get the blue strips for some reason. I didn't have time to work on it. But let me give you some context for this slide. In the 1990s, there was a University of Houston, maybe the late 80s, University of Houston political scientist named Donald Lutz. And Donald Lutz assembled a team of graduate students to comb the writings of the founding fathers in the 1770s and 1780s, and to see, what were the books or the quotes or the people that they were citing when they wrote, in their public writings. And since Lutz put this study out, there have been other very interesting accounts too that have kind of confirmed much of what Lutz has said. So if you look here, I have the results from the 1770s and 1780s. In the 1770s, Lutz found 544 citations to different writings in the founding fathers' writings, right? And when the founding fathers quoted authors, they quoted the Bible more than any other author or book. You see there 44%. Then second was political writers. I mean, these would be known as sort of Whig writers. These would be contemporary political writers of the day, kind of political tracts. People today, today we would quote, op-ed writers, or like David Brooks, or, something like that. Or George Will, or, these kinds of things. So they quoted these political writers of their day. Enlightenment, 18%. These would have been the great thinkers of the age of the Enlightenment, people like Rousseau or Voltaire or David Hume, these kinds of John Locke, right? These kinds of people. 11% classical writers. So these would be people like Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks and the Romans. Again, the founders drew on these classical sources, and then legal writers of the day, and then 3% other. And then in 1780, you see there's many more citations to these writers. And again, the Bible still is 34%. You see the Enlightenment goes up a little bit. My interest is not the shift over time or the change over time here. My interest in putting this up is just to show you how prominent the Bible was in the thinking and writing of the founding fathers. Now, I think there's two ways of looking at this data. One is the way I just suggested, right? One is that the Bible was cited more than any other book, right? And if you want to make something of that in the present, you could make that argument, right? That the founding fathers relied upon the Bible when they wrote about politics and the founding of the nation. The other way, of course, to look at it is the Bible, when compared to all of the other sources that they looked at, was below 50%. Right. So, in 1770, 66% of the sources that they cited were not the Bible. Right. In 1780, I'm sorry, 56% in 1770. In 1780s, 66% of the sources were not the Bible. The founders drew upon Enlightenment, political, classical, and legal authors. So again, it's not a perfect sort of study, because there could have been political or legal writers who also quoted the Bible, right? So it's hard to tell. But I think this just frames it very nicely, right? To show, number one, that the Bible was important, and number two, the founding fathers also quoted from a lot of other sources as well when they wrote. So again, I'll be happy to answer questions about that when we stop here towards the end. So let's break this down a little bit more, because what I'm particularly interested in is not just simply, that the founders quoted the Bible. I'm interested in, how they used the Bible, how they quoted the Bible, right? What did they put the Bible to use for? Again, I apologize for the small print on this. I'll try to read as much of it as I can without sort of reading everything for sake of time. But I picked this example because it's a great example of the way in which some of the founders utilized the Bible. You could also, I'll just use this Samuel Adams speech to the Continental Congress in September of 1777 as an example. You could also use things like Patrick Henry's famous "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech, and a few others, many others have references to the Bible. But here's just a little clip I took from Sam Adams's speech to the Continental Congress. Again, September 1777. So again, put this into context. This is more than a year after independence. And, this is in Philadelphia, obviously. And here's what Adams says, right? "Let us awaken then and evince a different spirit." Again, he's talking to the politicians in the room, right? The patriots, the founding fathers. "A spirit that shall inspire the people to preserve in this struggle until their rights and liberties shall be established on a rock." And notice what I've done here. I have highlighted all the references that he makes to biblical texts. And then on the right, I give you the actual text itself, right? To preserve in this glorious struggle until their rights and liberties shall be established on a rock. We have appealed to heaven for the justice of our cause, and in heaven we have placed our trust. Numerous have been the manifestations of God's providence in sustaining us in the gloomy period of adversity. We have, Ecclesiastes 7:14, we have had our cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, right? Reference there to the Exodus. We have been reduced to distress. The arm of the omnipotence, 2 Psalms he references there, has raised us up. Let us still rely in humble confidence on him who is mighty to save. Good tidings will soon arrive. right? We shall never be abandoned by heaven while we act worthy of its aid and protection. So again, this is probably an extreme example, but Samuel Adams was a devout, one might even say evangelical Christian. But you can also find these biblical references in people who were not as kind of over the top, evangelical as Samuel Adams was. But it's really fascinating to see the way in which Adams weaves these texts into his speech, and this was not uncommon, even on the floor of the Second Continental Congress. Obviously these bracketed verses I've added in. I should add that, right? But anyone sitting in the room that day, because of the sense of biblical literacy of the culture, would have recognized these as references to scripture. Now, let's talk a little bit here about the ministers themselves, because the Bible was used, all kinds of sermons were preached during this era by ministers. There were two of the most important verses, or I should say the most cited verses by, now we're talking here about published material, period, not just the published material of the founding fathers, but everything that was published, right? That includes ministers, sermons, theological works, and so forth. The two most popular verses quoted during the time of the American Revolution were Galatians 5:1 and Romans 13, which we'll get to next. And I'll just again illustrate this with one example. I picked a Presbyterian example because the Deerfield Presbyterian Church in New Jersey is about as old as Derry. It's from that era. I think Derry may be a little bit older, or a little bit younger, even I should say, than Deerfield. This is what the church looks like now. I think this is more of a late 18th century or early 19th century building. I can't remember off the top of my head. But Galatians 5:1, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. In 17, now you see 1775 there, but let me go back a little bit. In 1766, the pastor of the Deerfield, New Jersey Presbyterian Church, Enoch Green, preached a sermon on Galatians 5:1. And I remember being in the archives. I could point out specifically where I was when I found his sermons. They were sermon notes. And I found the 1766 sermon, the notes for it, with sort of, some prose here and there. And I began reading it. And Enoch Green interpreted this verse to simply mean this, right? Stand there, when he preached in 1766, stand fast there in the liberty where Christ has made us free. So he talked about, again, liberty from sin. Christ has set us free. Christ's death, burial, and resurrection has set us free from the bondage, the slavery of sin that can control our lives, and has set us free in Christ. Right. And maybe if you've heard a sermon on Galatians 5:1, you have heard that interpretation of the passage. I actually went back in the history of the church, went back to the first and second centuries. I went back to Augustine and Aquinas and Luther and Calvin. And I tried to get a feel for how the history of the Christian church interpreted Galatians 5:1. And in that 1766 sermon, Enoch Green was pretty on track, right? He said, "Stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ made us free." Right? That's the way. The freedom from sin, Christ's death as a way to free people from sin, was the way all of these ancient writers and Reformation era writers thought about Galatians 5, right? It was, little variations here and there, but it was pretty much a spiritual passage about the spiritual life of the Christian. So here I am back in the archives again, right? And I'm paging through Green's sermon book. I think I actually loose papers. They weren't in a book. And I get to 1775 now, 9 years later. And here I'm like, I see he preaches again on Galatians 5:1. So I say to myself, I'm probably not going to have to read this one very carefully. It's probably just a repeat from the sermon he preached 9 years ago, right? I've known pastors before. 9 years, they pull out the filing cabinet. Where's my Galatians 5:1 sermon? Hopefully the people won't remember it 9 years later, right? So I think it's going to be the same sermon, basically. But no, this time, Green has offered a completely different interpretation of this passage. And again, remember when he's writing, 1775. He defines liberty now not as freedom or liberty from sin, but he talks about liberty as liberty from the tyrannical British government, right? We need to be free from Parliament, who is putting us in bondage by taxing us with these taxes like the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts and the coercive acts and so forth, right? So suddenly the bondage or the slavery, that the yoke of bondage we need to be delivered from, had suddenly now become the British government in Green's new interpretation. And then literally, this blew me away when I read it. There's a part in the document, the sermon notes, where he says, Christ, and this is an exact quote, Christ ! Continental Army. In other words, Enoch Green is now preaching that, right? Christ has made us free, or no, the Continental Army will make us free. Christ is a metaphor for the Continental Army in this case. So you see the way in which certainly the Bible is being used, it's being preached, it's being interpreted. Now, again, I'm an American historian. I am not a Bible scholar. So I cannot tell you with any degree of expertise or training whether or not Enoch Green interpreted Galatians 5:1 correctly on that day. What I can tell you based on my expertise and training is that this was certainly a brand new interpretation of Galatians 5:1 that had never been seen before in the history of the Christian church, right? And this was pretty common, using scripture in this way. Now let's go to Romans 13, and we could also add 2 Peter 2:13 through 17 into the mix here, right? I'll just quickly read a part of Romans 13 for the sake of time here on the left. But as I'm reading, think about Romans 13 in the context of the American Revolution for a second, right? Think about me reading this in 1776. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers or government. For there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Right? It's a argument here about obeying government, God ordained government, right? Remember, these are British colonies, folks, right? Now, I also love there at the bottom, right? The last sentence, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, and so forth. You know what tribute is, of course, those are taxes, right? In other words, pay your taxes to the God-ordained government, right? Pay your stamp tax, pay your duties, pay your, and the list goes on, right? Now, the reason I bring it up, and then of course, First Peter 2, right? Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. And then, it goes on, and at the bottom, right? Again, think about this in 1776. Love the brotherhood, fear God, and what? Honor the king, right? You could see why this may have been a popular verse for people like the Anglican minister Samuel Seabury. Some of you who have seen the play Hamilton know that Samuel Seabury makes an appearance in that play where he debates Alexander Hamilton about these very things. But listen to what Seabury says. This is in his commentary on Romans 13 and First Peter 2, right? Submit yourselves to government. And listen what he reminds people. This is from 1777. When St. Peter and St. Paul, St. Peter, Second Peter, right? St. Paul, Romans. When St. Peter and St. Romans 13 wrote their epistles, they were under the government of heathen emperors and magistrates, Roman Empire, right? Who persecuted them and the other Christians, depriving them without any crime proved against them, but merely because they were Christians. And yet it was to these emperors and magistrates, even to Nero and Caligula, that the apostles commanded honor and respect at all times, and whenever it could be done consistently with obedience to God, duty, and submission. So, Samuel Seabury was always arguing that the American Revolution was unbiblical. It went against Romans 13 and First Peter 2. So again, you could see the way the Bible here is used for political purposes against the American Revolution, right? Although Samuel Seabury seems to be quoting just, would often just quote Romans 13 and interpret it rather than, kind of getting very metaphorical in the same way that Green did. So where does this leave us then? Some conclusions and maybe some points for conversation here in the last part of the course. The Bible was important to the founding era, no doubt. The Bible is everywhere in the founding era. You can't ignore it. There are those on the secular left, for example, who will rarely talk about that, the fact that the founders used the Bible or that they drew upon the Bible. It's just wrong to do that. You can't read these documents without finding the Bible everywhere. Second, the founding fathers often used the Bible in their political writings and speeches. We saw this with Lutz, the study that I just showed you, right? Again, we need to go deeper on that, though. Notice, how did they use it? And notice that they also used a bunch of other writings. Third, ministers used their pulpits to promote politics. And they shouldn't be there. They used the Bible in creative and metaphorical ways to do so. I think I'm kind of being generous there in some cases, but certainly these were new ways of thinking and using the Bible. In other words, they were taking the Bible and they were applying it to their particular moment. And sometimes it looked like more politics than necessarily biblical interpretation. The historian, one of my mentors, the historian Mark Knoll, once said that sometimes when you read some of these sermons, they tend to look more like comical propaganda than really deep biblical exegesis, the way the Bible is used in these sermons. And then finally, and we didn't get a whole lot of time to develop this, but you saw this with Samuel Adams. Many ministers used the story of Israel to frame their patriotic sermons, and even applied covenants between God and Israel to the cause of America. In other words, the cause of Israel, was often you see references to, say, the Babylonian captivity, or how they tried to oppose outside armies from coming in, right, and stopping them from having their Israel's liberty to worship the God the way they want. So again, I threw a lot of information here out at you. Again, hopefully it's enough to kind of trigger a little bit of a conversation, trigger you to perhaps be interested in pursuing on your own more deeply. Again, I blatant plug here. I delve deeply into all of these things in my book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And let me also plug currentpub.com, which is our new online platform where I write there. You can get the full piece on Mike Pence and see how I connect this history with Mike Pence's use of the Bible, right? It's not particularly new what Mike Pence did, but you can go on that site and we blog there. We have a daily article and a podcast too on evangelicals and politics, which draws on some of that history. So if I could just give that little plug to currentpub.com, I'm happy to answer any emails or anything about that. So let me stop my share. And so we got a good group out there. Let me open it up for questions. Debbie, maybe you can moderate and pick the.
Yep, I'll do my best. Yeah, so unmute yourself if you have a question or raise your hand. I can't quite see everybody, but we'll. John, while people are thinking, let me ask, and I don't want to go too fast if you're going to do this in the future. The separation of church and state that gets raised a lot.
Yeah. What about it?
When did that, was that always from the start?
Yeah, great question. I'll address this actually. I'll give a teaser, right, for next week. That's a good question, because I will talk about next week we want to talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and what they say about God. Of course, the separation of church and state idea comes from the First Amendment and the so-called Disestablishment Clause, which says there cannot be a church and a state. I was just writing my again, I do this history of evangelicals and politics podcast, and last night I was actually writing the script for that. The word wall of separation of church and state really does not come into the vernacular of American political and legal life until 1947, when that word is used. However, we do find Roger Williams in the 17th century, the founder of Rhode Island, using some similar type language, although he often talked about a garden that separates church and state. And Thomas Jefferson in the early 19th century wrote a letter to a group of Baptists in Connecticut, Danbury, Connecticut, where he used that idea of a wall. And then in 1947, the Supreme Court, and I referenced this actually, I think last week, the Everson case, the Supreme Court took Jefferson's use of the term and applied it to a church-state case, which became a kind of important precedent. But I'll mention some of that stuff next week rather. It's not in the idea of separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. And when the founders thought about it, they clearly had more in mind protecting the church from government intrusion, right, into their worship than they necessarily did protecting the government from Christian nationalism, if we were to use the term today. But the courts have reworked that in a lot of different ways to try to bring it up to date in light of, current events over the 19th and 20th and even into the 21st century. So I'll just leave it there and we'll develop that a little bit more perhaps next week.
Let's see any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt.
So you talked about Samuel Adams and his use of the Bible as my understanding is, Samuel Adams was probably more of an evangelical than many of the founding fathers. I think a lot of them would probably be better classified as deists. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but I think that's at least a common scholarly opinion, if not pretty well accepted. So how would you think that somebody like, say, Jefferson, who basically removes Jesus from the Bible, or at least miracles of Jesus from the Bible, or maybe Washington, who probably was a little bit more of somewhere in between those two, would use scripture in their political speeches?
No, great question. And I'm going to also kind of defer a little bit. I'll answer some part of your question. I'm going to defer to week 4, where we will get into this. But let's take, because we're doing the Bible today, let's take Jefferson, right? And your reference to the so-called Jefferson Bibles. As some of you know, and Matt seems to be aware of this, Thomas Jefferson developed or created his own version of the Bible. It was not published until the late 19th century. It was for personal use, right? He never published it as a book or anything. But what he did was he took out all of the supernatural aspects of the scriptures, right? Anything that he could not explain through Enlightenment reason, he removed. So, Jesus turning water into wine is removed. The resurrection, of course, right? The crucifixion, all of the miracles, everything is taken out of that book because his Bible, because or his version of the Bible, because he did not believe, though he was a man of reason, he was a man of the Enlightenment, and he said that can't be proven by logic and reason, so we need to remove it. And this, I think, gets to the heart of your question, Matt. Jefferson used the Bible often in his writings. He often even used the words of Jesus in his writings. And one of the reasons often we see Jefferson as this kind of anti-Christian person, which, he never claimed Christianity. He didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He didn't believe the Bible was the word of God, obviously. But we often tend to look at Jefferson from a Christian point of view, or at least certain Christian America defenders, Christian nationalists, right? They'll see him as an antagonist to Jesus, right? That get all the supernatural out. I would argue that Thomas Jefferson actually created this Bible because he had a deep, deep admiration for the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus. Love your neighbor, right? These kinds of golden rule, all these kinds of things. And because he could not get his head around the miracles and the supernatural things, Thomas Jefferson created this Bible so he could have kind of his own devotional. He would read it every night, right? He had his kind of own devotional in virtue, in the ethical teachings of Jesus, right? He thought society should be governed by certain kind of moral laws. So, you find Jefferson use, and you even see Jefferson referencing, and we'll talk about this next week, God. There's 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence, which he wrote, right? So Thomas, and so in my chapter in my book, which I wrote a decade ago, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? I took a little heat for titling the Jefferson chapter Thomas Jefferson, follower of Jesus. But he really was. He really was a follower of Jesus. He just didn't believe Jesus was God, didn't believe he died for the sins of the world, wasn't resurrected, and so forth. But he tried to live this kind of moral life. And I think when he talks about politics, he also references Jesus as well. And I think his ethic of following Jesus also made him very, very uneasy about his ownership of slaves. Now, he didn't do anything about it, but clearly he was always uneasy about the fact that his ownership of slaves did not fit with the ethics of Jesus. So I'll stop there and save the rest for week 4. Thanks, Matt.
More questions?
Can I have a follow-up question? I'm sorry.
Just let me just stop real quick. I'm 9:45. That's 9:46. If you need to go, and we'll stay here till 10 o'clock. I'll stay here till 10 o'clock. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
So,
yep.
Go ahead, Matt.
I've been wrestling with some of these ideas a lot recently, and it's I never thought about it in terms of founding fathers, but my question is so do you think that as a Christian who does believe in the resurrection and does believe in that Jesus is God, that Jefferson's view or use of the Bible is productive and good, or is it okay for me to promote Christian morality in secular circles the way Jefferson did, in order to avoid conflict, sort of? I feel like sometimes if I have conversations about morality with secular people, and I use biblical morals, sometimes that can be effective. But then if I come across as this weirdo conservative who
Bible
believes that
thumper.
Jesus resurrected from the dead, then they just ignore everything I have to say.
Yeah. No, this is a wonderful question, and it's a question that I've spent the better part of my career kind of thinking about and wrestling about. And you're giving me, Matt, like a minute to to respond. But I think the question you ask is one. I think this came up last week in the Q&A as well. To what extent can we learn from people who do not share our faith? I think is at the core of your question. In what way can we, learn from? I have a friend who refers to people like Jefferson and Plato and Aristotle and all these non-Christians as the to what one sense can we learn from the honest pagan, right? And I don't use pagan as a kind of, satanic cult in the woods way, right? I use pagan here as the way they would have used it in the ancient world, anyone who was not a follower of Jesus, right? So what could we learn from these people? What could we learn from sort of secular theories and so forth? I think two quick responses. One, I think as Christians, we always need to be engaging any kind of idea from a kind of Christian perspective, right? And we need to be critical of that. So of course, as a Christian myself, I am critical of much of what Thomas Jefferson believes about theology and the church and so forth. But I'm under the belief that all truth is God's truth, right? And there could be times when that honest pagan, so to speak, is actually saying something that is more true than the Christians in the room, right? Or they have been informed by clearer thinking on these matters than Christians. Now, again, I think Thomas Jefferson has a lot to say about morality, about the essential nature of virtue and ethics and morality to the survival of a republic, right? I'm not going to use him to preach a sermon or anything like that, but this gets to the point where when we are engaged in the world, there are places where even unbelievers are still speaking truth. And why should we be afraid of that? Right? As long as it's truth that, fits with. So when Thomas Jefferson talks about the teachings of Jesus and the ethical teachings of Jesus, if that's a point in which you can begin a conversation with somebody, right, about faith, then use it, right? Of course, use it, right? We can't get into these kind of at least I believe we can't get into these sort of binary, right? We only have to talk about the Bible, when we talk to people who are not Christians, right? There are points of commonality. There are points where we can find things in common that we agree with and sort of work from there and develop relationships and so forth. Of course, my view is, as a Christian, always sort of, wanting to move in the direction towards evangelism or sharing of one's faith and those kinds of things. But certainly the founding fathers are a core starting point that we may a lot of us all share, that we can go to. So I think that's perfectly fine, and I would actually encourage you, Matt, if that was a way to open up doors of conversation with other people.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughtful answer.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Miera. I don't have my video on, but I'm currently reading the book Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. I don't know if others have heard of that one, but he talks a lot about the church's complicity and slavery and racism throughout U.S. history. And I find it, interesting as we talk about how the Bible has been used for political purposes, throughout the American Revolution, how to advocate for freedom from Britain, it really wasn't applied in the same way. You mentioned this a little bit, to freedom from slavery and even rights for women. I struggle with trying to, thinking about the way the Bible has been used in American history. And I'm hoping that you'll be talking a bit more about some of those contradictions of even thinking of the US as somewhat of a, or even founding fathers as Christian leaders when they really weren't advocating for, freedom for all people.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm hoping this will come up a bit more, this contradiction, as we kind of wrestle, especially I think of like next week as you talk about the Declaration of Independence, and how it really was for white landholding men. Anyway, what extent you can address that.
Huge questions. I would recommend the book that Mira mentioned, Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. I do another podcast called The Way of Improvement Leads Home Podcast. You could track that down on Apple Podcasts or something. You could listen to my interview with Jamar, on that subject, where we tease out a lot of these questions. I can't remember which episode it is, but if you email me, I can give you the link if you can't find it. But everything you said is exactly correct, Mira. And we'll talk a little bit about this next week. Again, only so much time here, but we talk about the Declaration of Independence. But I'll respond to it this way. You'll notice in a lot of the biblical texts that I use today, the words bondage or slavery or those things came up. I think one of the great kind of moral inconsistencies of the founding fathers is that they used the term slavery in a largely political way. Slavery was a common word in the larger political language. Remember those political writers that I referenced, in that one slide? And it essentially means, of course, slavery is the opposite of freedom, right? Slavery is the opposite of bondage. And they utilize this term slavery all the time to talk about their own relationship with England and the taxes and so forth. Rarely did they use, except Matt pointed this out in his question. They had tinges of conscience, their conscience hit them at times, but rarely did they use the term slavery to describe the chattel or the property slaves that were in their own backyard. One of the great comments on this was from John Wesley, the famous 18th century evangelist and evangelical preacher, founder of the Methodist Church. John Wesley, I'm not going to get the quote exactly off the top of my head, but when asked whether or not the American Revolution was just and whether or not it was moral, John Wesley from England, of course, famously, he was opposed to the American Revolution. He famously said, these founding fathers talk about slavery, but they don't see the slaves in their own backyard. How can they talk about slavery when they don't see, these things happening with the actual African slaves that they own? Now, it's a little disingenuous for Wesley to say that, because most of Great Britain also benefited from, including Wesley himself, who was not a slaveholder, but certainly he benefited from the products of slavery, right? But these are the kinds of questions I think that are important to note whenever you use these terms, like the founders use these terms like slavery and so forth. There really is an inherent moral contradiction at the heart of it. And one more point, I wish we had more time on this. Again, I'm not doing this to kind of plug my writing as much as just to give you resources. But I talk about the use of the Bible and this way in which especially evangelical Christians have used the Bible in both my book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, but also in my more recent book, Believe Me, the Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. And in both of those books, I point out that, the Bible was used. Now we get into the churches, right? Less about the founding fathers. The Bible was used regularly to defend the institution of slavery, especially when abolitionists began to point out the moral inconsistencies with slavery. It was at this point, out of fear that they would lose their institutions, that most in the South developed these rather sophisticated biblical defenses of slavery using the Bible. So again, this would be just another example in the 19th century about how the Bible has been used to promote these kinds of things. so yeah, I mean, again, Tisby's a great resource on that, and I'd refer you there and refer you to some of my own writing on this. But everything you said is worth pointing out, Mira.
Thank you. Charlie?
Yeah, in your lecture today, you used the term "used" frequently, and what I see is we're not in an audience with God, we're in an audience with our fellow man, and so we use those words which we think will accomplish the goal we're seeking. So frequently we're using things grossly out of context, and you see that in all aspects of life, and the goal involved with any conversation has to be kept in mind when the conversation is being had, because we are all being used, if you will, to accomplish an end point. I don't think the question of truth is something that is way outside of normal conversation. And I don't think that any of the formative things of our nation were necessarily invoking truth as much as accomplishing a goal.
Yeah, great point. I mean, remember, the founding fathers are founding fathers. They're not ministers. They're not clergy. They're not church. They don't care about the church as much. They have one goal: to build a nation, right? They have certain ways in which that nation should be constructed. And I often say this: if the Bible or Christianity is useful to them achieving their ultimate goal of building a nation, then they will use it. And they will use it for that purpose. If the Bible is useful for them to oppose the American Revolution, they will use it. Now, I would actually argue that, and last week, I don't see him here today, but last week, one of the member who is not of your congregation, why am I blanking on his name right now? I'm embarrassed by this. But the president, the recently retired president of Eastern Mennonite University, was with us, sitting in. He had seen this about my blog on my blog. I think if there was a form of Christianity, and I'm thinking here about traditional Anabaptist and Mennonite faith, right, who separate church and state in profound ways. If there was a form of Christianity whose purpose was to critique the nation, or as Mira pointed out, to critique the way in which slavery was embedded within the nation, or to critique what the founding fathers were doing by giving privilege to only white men, or to critique some kind of moral dimension of how the way the founding fathers were creating this country, I don't think the founding fathers would have any use, back to this point, for that kind of Christianity, because it wouldn't have served their ultimate purpose, right? So I think it's important to remember that. Again, we often tend to get confused and think that the founding fathers were somehow creating like some kind of Christian society. No, they wanted to create a republic. And if the Bible could produce virtuous people who would, be good moral people that cared about morality. We'll talk about this also in week 4. The Bible was going to be useful for that. Yeah, great point.
It looks like we've reached our
Yes.
time.
So much to talk about, and
Yeah.
it's hard to do it in this forum to get everything in there, but yeah, hopefully I could point you just to resources, right? To think about it.
Good job. And Zoom may cut us off here at any moment. I'm not sure if it will or not, but John, thank you for giving us a lot to think about.
Okay. Hope to see you all next week.